Hello, welcome to La Excellence. I am Harsha Mannava and we are discussing this book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. So we began agricultural revolution and we saw that it was not entirely beneficial and we called it history's biggest fraud. Today we will see some more changes that came about in human culture starting with agriculture because we call it agricultural revolution, which means its impact was far and widespread. So let's see what are the changes it brought about in our life. First, the most important observation we made was agriculture resulted in permanent settlements. From being nomadic, people started settling down next to rivers, next to fertile plains in delta areas where agriculture became possible. But ironically, settling down caused people's turf to shrink. Why do we say that? If you take a forager, a hunter, there was no home that they had. So their home was characterized by the larger territory that they kept roaming about in collecting food. So there was no one site they called as home, but the concept of home was defined in terms of a territory across which they moved and over which they had some sort of claim. But when we began moving to agriculture, we formed villages, right? We said that agriculture led to formation of village. So the concept of village is only as old as agriculture, and which is only about 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. So before that, village was not there because we are used to the idea that village has been around forever, but clearly it was not so. So when people settled down and they started claiming ownership over land, this plot is mine. So the concept of a house came about. So from home being defined as an area over which they had some sort of claim, home now started being defined in terms of a predefined plot and some cultivable land. So, and all of this led to some changes in human thinking. Earlier there was no concept of me, my, belongs to me, my ownership. Now farming meant that people needed ownership of land, so they had to claim some land as their own. All of this led to a self-centered thinking. So this whole me, my, belongs to me, this kind of thinking began with agriculture when people started valuing land and individual goods highly. So today, if you look at the territory over which of the planet that humans call as their habitat, that humans use for their living purposes or they use to grow their crops, it's only about 2% of the land. Only 2% of the land is what we use today. But hunter-gatherers, though they were far fewer than us, the land that they claimed and the land they used was far more. That is because they kept roaming. They didn't use, their land use was not intensive, but rather it was extensive. That is far more area but far less usage. For us it is far less area but far more usage of a given plot of land. Next, along with farming, the other important thing that farming did was it created the concept of future. Until farming came about, future, the notion of a future was not so important because people lived in some sort of hand-to-mouth existence. So they're thinking of planning for the future, planning for the next year. We have 5-year plans, right? All that was beyond their reach. So there was no concept of future. They woke up and they used to go about finding their food and that's it. They used to have some sense of time, that's it. But when people shifted to agriculture, this idea of future became important. Why is that? For two reasons. One, farming had some kind of seasonal cycles, right? We have Rabi, Kharif and so on. So farming is seasonal. Second, farming also had a lot of uncertainty in it. Both these issues made people think in terms of future. What do we mean by this? For example, if it is seasonal, how does it make us think in terms of future? You have to sow. You have to sow the crop, sow the land. So You have to prepare the land first before you sow, and you must make sure that you are sowing and preparing your land just before there is rainfall. Like right now, around this time, people start, because it's about monsoon is coming, people start preparing their land. So all this needs some time orientation. Similarly, agriculture has a huge uncertainty to it, isn't it? There is always a risk of crop failure because of various reasons: rainfall, flood, pest attack, you name it, has huge risk. So agricultural population always live under the fear of risk. Because of all this, people realized we may have good crop this year, but what about next year? We have to save, we have to be careful, or we have to grow. Our agriculture is seasonal, so there is going to be rain next month, which means we have to work on it this year. This month we have to prepare in advance, and we don't know what it is going to be next year, so we may have to save some, keep some with us as storage, as buffer stocks. So all of this these worries came with agriculture, and it created more emphasis on future. People started living in endless thoughts of imagination. If a man suffered badly this year, he would now recover out of it, fight that starvation, and prepare himself for the next year, because he thinks maybe the next year will be better. So people now, from living in the present, hunter-gatherer lives in the present moment, present day. Now farmers began living in the future. To make it worse, religion made them live even about after death. They began thinking as if living in the future was not enough. They began thinking about life after death, next life, and so on. So all this time orientation was an outcome of agricultural way of life. Now, the other important consequence of agriculture was agriculture gave rise to large scale social and political systems. What do we mean by this? Remember what we discussed in the previous video. We said people moved to agriculture in the hope that it would increase their food availability. In some way it did. They produced a lot. But what they didn't imagine, what they could not fathom, was that along with more production, society became getting transformed. Because in agricultural societies, we discussed there was raids, right? There was some warfare. So some people had to fight in wars. This led to some elite who were stronger, who were more skilled. Now with an emergence of elite, society was until then equal. But now elite started emerging. Once elite emerged, what did this elite do? They used their power and status to capture a big share of the produce that was not in line with their share in the population. They used to grab so much of the produce and live an extravagant life. So the farmer did produce more, but unfortunately the benefits of this larger production did not accrue to the farmer, but rather the elite captured them. So the elite formation, society started becoming stratified. From being an egalitarian society with agriculture, we began moving towards what we call a stratified society, some belonging to a superior class compared to others, some were in superior status compared to others. This sort of elite emerged. So Harari points this as, and these elite were the ones who had power, right? They were kings, priests, the bureaucrats, the generals, the warriors. But they were only tiny. The elite were never the majority. So Harari points this out by saying that history is something very few people have been doing while everyone was busy plowing fields and carrying water buckets, because a big chunk of the population was not participant in the so-called history that we all read, the wars, the decisions, the monumental architecture, all of that was built by a few, whereas the rest were busy going about plowing their fields. That is how things began changing. Now, it was not just elite. Over time, this elite, and from being village level organization, society began moving towards larger territorial organization. What do we mean by that? For example, new political entities like kingdoms emerged after a period of time, because initially you had village communities, but village communities quarreled among themselves. It was leading to some kind of trouble, to the waste of resource. So to enforce order over some groups of villagers, a chief or a king used to be nominated. Over a period of time, such tiny kings grew in size, and we had kingdoms which eventually gave rise to empires. For example, we read about Indus Valley civilization, the early civilizations, right? Indus Valley civilization in India, but even before that there was the Egyptian civilization around the same time, a little before. Egyptian civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization, these were all some kind of kingdoms which emerged, and over time kingdoms gave rise to empires. The first empire is that of Sargon the Great, the Akkadian Empire that came in the Mesopotamian, the Middle East area. This was the first empire. What is the first empire in India? Not IVC, by the way. IVC is the first kingdom. The first empire in India is that of the Mauryan Empire. It was based out of what we call as the Nandas. All of them gave rise to the Mauryan Empire. That is the first empire in India. Not just India, this kind of organization started happening all across the world. For example, around 221 BC, the Qin dynasty, just about the time Mauryas were ruling in India, the Qin dynasty united China. China until then was broken among many tiny kings. All of them were united, and the Qin dynasty created a Chinese empire. So this kind of complex political organization started taking birth. So you see the beauty, right? You had some hunters who had band level organization. Next came farmers who started having village level communities. Now it was more sophisticated. We started having empires, large, which ruled over large areas. It was not just large areas. Empires were different in the sense that there was now a class, a section of people who called themselves the rulers. These people did not participate in the day-to-day economic activity like farming. They were full-time officials, and whose full-time job was to fight wars, enforce laws, and keep order. And kingdoms were also expensive affairs, right? Because kingdoms needed to pay the army, they needed to pay the bureaucracy. The king needed some monies to keep his empire going. How did he fund his empire? Then the kings started levying taxes. Now, so when you levy taxes, how do you collect them? So a class of officers called as revenue officers started being formed, and these revenue officers went about collecting taxes. So you see, from village level community, we transformed over time into huge structures with kings, armies, generals, ministers, bureaucracy, revenue officers, and so on. But the question that we have to now ask is, fine, it's amazing, but the interesting point is, for centuries, for millions of years, humans lived as individual small groups. The concept, because in empire, what is this whole empire that we talked about? It works on the foundation that people cooperate on a large scale. But humans all through their evolution were used to living in small groups. So cooperation with impersonal strangers, thousands, lakhs of them over a large territory, didn't come naturally to them. We did not have biological instincts for mass cooperation, isn't it? How do we have them? Because we've never lived, we've only lived in this kind of large systems only for the past 3000, 4000 years, but before that we lived in small groups. So, and living in large numbers calls for some cooperation, but we didn't have this biological instinct for mass cooperation that facilitated or that allowed these larger systems. What was the solution? So how did humans overcome this biological limitation to create these elaborate systems? The answer lies in the same old concept we discussed earlier, that is shared myths. Shared myths bridged this gap, And this belief, when people started believing in some common myths, this common belief system functioned as the basis over which they cooperated. And it's not just that. Once this cooperation comes into place, this large scale cooperation is not entirely, just and fair. It also has some element of oppression and exploitation in it. For example, you saw the pyramids were built, but who built them? They were built by slaves. Take the Roman Empire. Who built the Colosseum, the huge stadium? Some slaves built it, while other slaves sacrificed their lives for gladiators, while the rich Roman elite enjoyed the fun. So, mass cooperation and large political systems were beneficial to an extent, but they were not without their share of evils, their share of oppression and exploitation. Now, coming back to the issue of shared myths. So, shared myths formed this common basis over which we cooperated. Now, what are the shared myths? They are primarily in the shape of laws, political philosophy, some religious beliefs we all hold. Let us take two famous shared myths that we all have studied in the history. One is the Code of Hammurabi, the other is the American Declaration of Independence. By discussing this, we'll understand how these were interestingly shared myths. The Code of Hammurabi, right? It looks like this. This is the Code of Hammurabi, comparable to Ashoka's Dhamma in India. Hammurabi is a king. Who is Hammurabi? Hammurabi is a king of the Babylonian Empire in the Mesopotamia. He was a famous king, just like our Ashoka. And Hammurabi gave this code. He gave a code called Hammurabi's Code. It was found on a piece of huge rock, and the code had detailed provisions like if who kills whom, what is the punishment, if a girl is killed by another man, what is the punishment, so on. We won't do the details, but broadly, what are the underlying principles or underlying ideas behind Hammurabi's Code? Because the people of Babylonia lived together, the possibility of living together happened because all of them believed in Hammurabi's Code. If they said, you believe in Hammurabi's Code, but I don't believe, then Hammurabi's empire would not have been possible. The common living was allowed because all of them agreed to follow Hammurabi's Code, just like all of us today agree to follow the Constitution. How does the Indian nation survive? Because we all say we believe in that document, the Constitution. So Hammurabi's Code was some such document that formed as the shared belief system of the people of Hammurabi's empire and kingdom. Now, what are the principles of this Hammurabi? First, Hammurabi says God appointed Hammurabi to give these laws. He doesn't say he is God. He says God appointed him to give these laws. And the entire code, underlying this entire code, is the principle of hierarchy. Hammurabi's Code doesn't assume people are equal. It assumes people are unequal. So he divides people into two genders, men, women. Men have privileges whereas women don't have. And there are three classes: superiors, commoners and slaves. Superiors were rich, had many privileges. Slaves were under superiors, they had no rights, no freedoms and had a miserable life. Then there were commoners whose position was okay. And those were very unjust according to modern standards. For example, children were considered as a property of parents. So if one man's daughter was killed by another man, this man could go and kill that man's daughter. Very strange, right? He killed this man's daughter. So why does this man's daughter deserve death? She didn't do anything. That is because, and killing this man's daughter was considered justice. Why? Because they felt the daughter was the man's property. So that was the kind of notion they had. And justice was all based on revenge. If A kills B, now B's son or B's brother can go kill A. So it was an eye for an eye based justice. So that was the kind of philosophy that Hammurabi followed. And this was considered justice. Hammurabi's Code was very popular. Even after Hammurabi's death, this code was very popular in the Middle East, isn't it? And now compare, you flash 2000 years and come back to 18th century, the American Declaration of Independence. It is the basis for the American Constitution that many Americans follow today, and in fact is a model for the rest of the liberal constitutions across the world. What does American Declaration of Independence say? It says all men are created equal by the God. This is an exact violation of Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi said men are not equal. All men are not equal. And even within humans, men and women were different. Men were superior to women, and among men, some were superior compared to others. So Hammurabi's code was widely accepted when it was his time. It was based on hierarchy. Likewise, our Declaration of Independence, a widely popular document, but that says people are equal. Now, who is right? Both were justice. Remember, who is right? Nobody is right. Both these value systems are the myths we created. They don't exist as an objective reality. That people are equal is not an objective reality. It has no scientific basis. The people are unequal equally has no scientific basis. We believed at one point of time people are unequal. At another point of time, we believed people are equal. That's all. Both of them are our belief systems, and both of them have no scientific basis, and both of them are not beyond us. They are our belief systems, isn't it? How do we resolve this dilemma then? Otherwise, that one justice is based on hierarchy, another justice is based on equality. That is because both are the belief systems we created. Of course, there is no doubt that one belief system creates a better society than the other. Definitely, equality is a better ideal, but it is still an ideal. It is better because it is a value because we believe so. It is not like gravity. The force of gravity exists independent of our existence. Gravity is there whether we are not or there or not. But equality exists only because we say it must be there. So this is how shared myths allowed us to cooperate, and it is the basis on which all of us are living in large elaborate structures. So Harari calls all this imagined order. This order that we created with some above others, with laws, with common beliefs, all of this is what he calls as imagined order. And imagined order is created through documents like the Hammurabi Code and the documents like this one, the American Declaration of Independence. This is the American Declaration of Independence. So these documents are those which facilitate this imagined order, which is the reason behind how we live together. Now, once this imagined order is created, how do people believe in the imagined order? Like I said, I don't believe in it. Or we said, imagined order is created by us. It works only because everybody agrees to believe it. But what if some say they don't agree? Or to put it in other words, how is imagined order perpetuated? How does society make sure everybody agrees to it? Through education, through schools, or from the moment we are born, our socialization process constantly reminds us about the principles of imagined order. They're part of our fairy tales, our dramas, our paintings, our songs, our political propaganda, our architecture, recipe, fashion, so much. All the ways of thinking around us is based on the imagined order or the codes that we have agreed to follow. We have agreed to follow them because it allows us to live in large groups and cooperate with one another, and sometimes even cooperate with strangers. But to make it more simply, what are the factors that prevent people from making sure this order exists? What is the way in which people go with it without realizing that it is only that their imagination that has created it? How do people learn to live with it without questioning the very basis that this whole thing is an imagination? First, the imagined order is becoming part of our desires. It propagates itself by becoming part of our desires. For example, how is that? Take this idea of romantic consumerism. What is romantic consumerism? First, romanticism means, it means that people, happiness is in variety. That to be happy or to have a higher life is to have different experiences. That is romanticism. Take consumerism. Consumerism tells that the way to happiness is to consume more. If you are unhappy, if you are moody, buy a new product, eat a new food, buy new clothes, buy new cars, buy new gadgets. So buy. This is consumerism. Romantic consumerism is like a very good marriage between two very perfect fits. For example, to understand this, let us take this popular desire to take a holiday abroad. Most of us like foreign holidays, right? Don't we? But this desire for a holiday abroad is not rooted in our natural, is not natural to us. It is not rooted in our genes. Because take chimpanzees. Would chimpanzees want to go on a worldwide tour? No. An alpha male would just want to monopolize as many women as possible and increase the troop size. Why go that far? Take our ancestors. Our ancestors, they didn't express their love for their women, for their wives or lovers by taking them on a holiday to Paris or Sydney. They used to build tombs where they were. But modern man believes in this foreign exotic holiday. That's the way people bond, that's the way a man expresses love towards a woman and so on. So all of this is an outcome of what we call as romantic consumerism. People are consuming and they're trying to have different experiences, and this is what is driving most of our lives. And behind all this, what is it? The desire for this kind of life is what is driving our thinking. So we don't realize that this whole idea of romantic consumerism is an idea we created, that this is a better life, that romanticism and consumerism is a better life is a notion we created. But now we start living with it as if it was given to us, as if it was some supernatural force came and told to us that this is the way to live. And we live it without realizing we in the first place have created it. So some of these shared myths become part of our desires and they perpetuate themselves, and we become a mere victim of them. Next, some of them are embedded into our material world. These shared myths or these imagined orders become part of our material world. For example, take this idea of individualism. Individualism is certainly an imagined concept, because 1000-2000 years ago this idea was never there. People never believed in individualism, they believed in collectivism. Because traditionally, how was the Indian family? It was a collective joint family. There was no concept of privacy. A couple would not have their own personal room. There was no concept that a mother has exclusive rights to her children. But look at family today. There is nuclear family. Within nuclear family, so much privacy. Each child has his own room. Not just children have their room, each child has their own room. And the parents in America, for example, cannot enter the child's room without knocking. That is because in our society, individualism is emphasized. A child is told to derive his own value from what he is. He is told to disregard what others say about him. If others comment or deride him, he is told to ignore, don't take it seriously, you know what you are. But in the past, we believed in collectivism. A person's status, a person's value came from his birth, his status in the hierarchy. And at that time, a person was very careful about his image. He made sure that he was not a laughing stock of others. He always was keen on what others thought about him. But today we are told, don't bother what others think about you. You know what you are. So that kind of individualism is an outcome of modern world. So individualism, for example, is a part of this value of individualism has its manifestation in our material world, in our housing structure, in our families. So once again, these imagined concepts perpetuate themselves by becoming part of our material world. And lastly, not just the most important part, these imagined concepts are intersubjective. What is they are not objective, that we are sure. They don't exist independent to us. What do we mean by intersubjective? By that we mean these imagined ideas exist in the form that they are existing in the shared imagination of millions of people. They don't exist independent of a person, correct, but they don't only exist within a person. For example, your dreams, your beliefs, your ideas are all subjective to you. They are subjective reality. Whereas a tree, the gravity, relativity, space, these are objective. Whether you and I exist or not, they are existing. They are objective. Whereas your beliefs, your opinions and tastes are subjective, they are yours. But what is intersubjective? Intersubjective means they exist in the shared imagination of millions of people, like law, money, gods. For example, the dollar, the human rights, the concept of United States of America, these exist in the imagination of billions to the extent that no single individual can threaten their existence. If tomorrow I say I don't believe in human rights is an imagined concept, we created it, it doesn't exist, I will be a laughing stock. They may even put me in an asylum, in a mental hospital, something is wrong with this man. Or if I say there is no money, money is just our fiction, it is just what we created, it doesn't exist naturally. Once again, people will be shocked, this guy is a lunatic, that's how they will push me out. So if I alone were to stop believing in the dollar, in the human rights, it wouldn't matter much. So the imagined concepts we create become like prison walls, we get locked in them. How do we get locked in them? In these three ways. They become part of our material world, they shape our desires, and they are intersubjective. By intersubjective, it means that they exist because millions and large sections of population believe in them, believe that they are right, and they don't realize that they are imagined. This belief of this belief or the placement in the consciousness of a large section of population makes them very strong. And if these have to be changed, what happens? How do you change them? To change them, you must change the consciousness of billions of people, which is again not easy. To change them, you must change the consciousness of so many people. You must mobilize them. How do you mobilize them? Through a political movement, to a religious cult, whatever. But once again, to mobilize them against one imagined concept, you must now create another imagined concept, because any mobilization requires common belief system. So what did the French Revolution do? Before that, kings mobilized people's support using concept of divine rights, that kings have divine rights. After French Revolution, the rebels mobilized the French people based on the concept of equality and liberty. Now both equality, liberty and divine rights are imagined concepts. Both of them are creation of human imagination. Both of them don't have objective existence. So even if you have to change the imagined concepts, imagined order, you must create an alternative imagined order to mobilize people against one imagined order. So in that sense, there is no escape from this. So we become a part of these prison walls that we created. We have created them in the first place in order that we may have common existence and we may create a system of cooperation. So that's it in this session. We will take up the next chapter. Until then, thank you. Goodbye.